Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here as always with Walter Russell Mead of Tablet, the Wall Street Journal, Hudson Institute, and the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. Let's start with this week's news, of which there is a lot. So instead of doing our normal 3 separate news items, Walter, let's just jump into what I think is the single biggest story. I'm sure you'll agree, and just see where that takes us. So as of the vote counting on Thursday, Donald Trump had improved on his 2020 vote share in 49 states and the District of Columbia, including double-digit improvements in California, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. The only state where he did worse was Washington, which moved to the Democrats by 0.3%. Of the counties in the United States with nearly complete results, more than 90% of them shifted in favor of Trump in the 2024 presidential election, according to the New York Times. That's at least 2,367 counties that shifted in favor of Trump, whose margin decreased in only 240 counties. Walter, not just Trump's victory, which we all know, but his margin of victory. Do you think of this as news or faux news?
Oh, it's news. This one is news. I think like a lot of people, I thought that the election was a toss-up. Maybe in the last few days, it had edged in the Harris direction a little tiny bit. So this is not only news about American public sentiment being in a different place from where many of us thought it was, marginally, but significantly, but also that the American polling industry really is joining the chicken augury priests of the ancient Roman Empire with demonstrable lack of ability to read events. We can talk about margin of error and so on, and certainly it's there, but they massively underestimated the Trump vote in 2016. They all said, oh, this was a disaster. We must never do that again. 2020, again, they underestimated. He lost the election, but by a lot less than they expected he would. And so again, coming up to 24, oh, we've underestimated. We need to rethink, blah, 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 blah. And again, they failed. So it tells us that they don't know what they're doing in an important metric. And it also would suggest to me that there are a lot of these other polls that we sort of take for granted. Okay, well, maybe they get this presidential polling wrong, but when they look at how many Americans sympathize with Hamas or how many Americans do X or Y, is this kind of leftward tilt to maybe people on the left just answer pollsters more often. I don't know what it is. I've absolutely got no idea. So there's that. But I think there are also some other things. One, I think, would have to be that Harris's gender gap was not nearly as big as she expected, that at the presidential level, the abortion issue did not have anything like the impact that Democrats thought it would. There were a lot of people thinking, Democrats, by the way, and fearful Republicans who thought that abortion would be this sort of magic issue that ignited a whole massive constituency. And it just didn't. And in a sense, this is a bit of a vindication of the strategy that says that the best way to deal with an extremely divisive issue like abortion is to return it to the states. And then people who, Alabama can have one set of laws and Illinois can have another, and we just all go forward. And yes, it's a contentious, difficult, in some cases, heart-wrenching issue. But the divisions aren't going to go away. The question is, how do we as a society both, how do we live with ourselves? How do we live with our divisions as we go forward? And it just may be that federalism is the answer to this and perhaps to some other issues as well. So that was a dog that didn't bark. I think another one was the vaunted left-wing votes. The Democrats were losing votes on the left because of their insufficient compassion for Gaza, for Palestine, insufficient sympathy for the Palestinian cause. again, certainly, you see the Jill Stein vote and even the Trump vote in Dearborn was much higher than the people would have expected, but it had absolutely zero impact on Michigan. And people have pointed out that a pro-Israel Jewish senator won a statewide race in Michigan by a very, very comfortable margin, even as Harris lost the state. This would suggest that the whole the sort of watch out for the tsunami of anti-Israel Islamic voting is just not as big of a deal as some had hoped and others had feared. But I think the real news, and we go on, the youth vote is less liberal, less progressive than a lot of people thought. It's just possible that kids in Ivy League schools are unrepresentative of their generation as a whole, that maybe these are kids from the famous Charles Murray bubble who are not at all reflecting and not at all sort of spokespeople for their generation, much as that they would like to be thought of that way. And that the average American kid is not all that different from the average American parent, for better and for worse. That's a possibility here. But I think the big news to me was the Hispanic shift to Trump. Again, even in an election, or especially an election where immigration was such a factor. And I look back to the 1920s and teens when that was the last time that the percentage of foreign-born people in the United States was sort of comparable to where we are now, and where you'd seen just a wave of massive immigration from sort of from parts of Europe that Americans at that time thought of as rather culturally different, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and actually that's when a lot of our original Middle Eastern immigrants came to the U.S. from Syria and so on. And what happened was that a national consensus, strong national consensus in favor of free, unlimited, unrestricted migration ended with a very, very strong national consensus for very tight limits on immigration. And a tipping point there was when many of the migrant populations in the U.S. wanted to close the door. It's like, I'm inside now. It's time to pull up the drawbridge. We don't want to, because the new waves of immigrants were competing for their wages and for their jobs. And so there's sort of sympathy for people in the home country was eclipsed by their sense that as an American, I've got a different set of interests now. And the Hispanic shift, again, especially really strong in those South Texas counties along the border, where overwhelming Hispanic populations go majority for Trump. This suggests that in this country, we are, we've reached a tipping point in the migration debate. Now, I, for one, very much hope we don't repeat the kind of excessive anti-immigrant thing that we saw with the 1923 law that essentially on a quota basis cut migration into the United States by something like 90+%. I think we benefit from immigrants. We could use both sort of, hardworking, not very skilled people who just want to come here and work really hard and build a better life for their families. I like these people. I'm glad they want to come to my country, and we need them. But legally and in a structured system that is democratically agreed upon by the American people and seen to be operated in the interests of those who are citizens here now. And then also a certain number of highly skilled immigrants with talents and skills that really build up our country. We need that, but I think we're now at a place where we're looking at how do we better regulate. And it's going to be difficult. There will be mistakes made. People will run to extremes and so on. But I think on the whole, it's a necessary turn. And I note, by the way, that the Europeans seem to be getting more extreme than we are on this. So they're definitely shifting. So the Hispanic turn toward Trump, though, it's not just a migration factor. I think it's a major sort of revelation that there've been two potential paths for this wave of hemispheric. I'm going to call them hemispheric rather than Hispanic. Margaret, for one thing, all my Brazilian friends get furious when we just say Hispanic here. Hey, what am I, chopped liver? But also, just it gives us a better sense of both the diversity and some of the cultural connectivities among these groups. But anyway, this there was one sort of model that the left would like them to go into, which is that they're going to be another racial, non-white, even anti-white in some ways group that's going to operate, can only integrate into American society through a system of quotas. DEI is your only friend, and that's your path in. You will never be fully accepted, and so you have to mobilize for a foothold. There was that path, and that is the path that a lot of our friends on the left would like to see them take. And that's behind a lot of this new American majority, new left-wing majority. The immigrants are going to be permanently alienated from American concepts as traditionally understood. They're going to be, sort of proponents of socialism and all of this. May I say this is exactly what people thought the European immigrants were going to be in the teens and 20s. And you had a whole generation of American lefties who kind of grew up with this as their faith that we're on the winning side because the European migrants with their socialist and communitarian roots are going to help overthrow this evil American capitalism, and we're moving forward. Almost exactly what a lot of young lefties think today will happen. But I think we're seeing that the Hispanics are taking the other road. The hemispheric immigrants, excuse me, for my political incorrectness there, are taking another route, which is we're immigrants. And we don't see ourselves primarily as objects of discrimination and prejudice, or rather, there's nothing that our own hard work and skills and success can't wipe away. And that's what we're going to do. Will it work? Will it not work? That's the future. I don't know that. But if this is where this new wave of American migrants is going to go, it's actually one of the most profound pieces of news that we've seen in quite a while.
You mentioned the Hispanic vote and immigrants and the children and descendants of immigrants. Trump also cracked 30% in New York City just as a whole, the best performance by a Republican since 1988. And it was driven by a 35% improvement in the Bronx relative to 2020, improvements of 20% and 17% in Manhattan and Queens. We're talking about some of the most, ethnically and racially diverse places in America and in the world. What do you make of some of these projections that, Trump's GOP, which began as the party of white grievance, may have found its footing in 2024 as a party of kind of the multiracial working class? Do you think that's just kind of specific to Trump and the circumstances of this year, or is there a real future for a coalition like that?
Well, of course, we're going to see. The future remains unknown, but I do think that this idea that the outs want to knock the building down. You hear this loud banging on your door. Is this the mob trying to knock down America, or is this a group of people who want to get in? And I think fundamentally, the majority of the people who come to this country from all over the world, what they actually want is to be Americans. And they haven't come here because they want America to be more like Nicaragua. They've come here because Nicaragua and Venezuela and Nigeria and some other places are really not very well governed and don't offer a lot of opportunity. And they would like to come to a place that works differently and works better. And so here they are. And they're looking, which party seems to me to be trying to take me back to Venezuela or toward Venezuela, and which party is trying to preserve the things that make America different. And I'm not saying this is kind of some subtle political science, deeply nuanced worldview. It's a, kind of big primary, it's a binary choice, and people make it for their own reasons. But to the extent that people see the division between the two American parties in those terms, and that more working class and sort of aspirant, the aspirational side of America is signing up with Trump, who is, let's not forget, not necessarily the most obvious vehicle for this kind of movement to form around. It says something really profound about the depth of their hunger to get in and to find some people who say it's a great country, it's a great system, and we want to keep it that way, and that's the best way for you to go forward.
Just one final question about the headlines this week. You mentioned earlier that, we heard a lot about this being a gender gap election and a generation gap election. I saw there was a survey from the Associated Press of 120,000 Gen Z voters that showed that Trump improved among Gen Z men and Gen Z women relative to 2020, which I think really shocked a lot of people. Some people I think have been attributing this to the kind of factors you mentioned earlier, like, Gen Z is concerned about things like everybody else, like inflation and housing prices and stuff like that. There's also been a lot of kind of punditry about how Trump made a more effective use of media than Harris did this cycle, going on Joe Rogan and, the Rogan universe of kind of alternative media podcasts, whereas Harris did more kind of traditional, highly controlled, highly produced, celebrity-driven media events. Do you attribute anything to that?
Well, I think in some ways, Harris, she was kind of a cringe candidate. She's picked in the smoke-filled rooms by machine politics. The whole thing was kind of engineered. The coup, first of all, the machine kept her from being a primary, where I am almost 100% sure she would not have won an open Democratic primary race. She's just not a very great candidate. It's nothing to do with her, any doesn't talk about her worthiness to be president or anything like that. She's just not a very charismatic candidate and not very good on her feet and that sort of thing. So a kind of unappealing person was picked in an unappealing way, basically, and all the news reports sort of suggest that Nancy Pelosi was the driving force, and that Biden actually gave a critic, by his open endorsement of her, sort of blocked any kind of open process. Well, that's not what Gen Z is sort of hungering for. More of that, more boomers in small rooms comfortably deciding your fate. So I think that that was just a series of really bad decisions that she was not able to overcome. People may overestimate the degree to which, well, they underestimate the degree to which young people generally feel that they're being screwed over, not just by the system, but by the blue system. In particular, I meet a lot of young people, and what I find is they go that 18 years old, you start assuming $20,000-$30,000 of student loans a year. Nobody really, and all the people involved in getting you to do this have a financial interest in you signing on the dotted line. I think if you had a car company that worked the way a lot of colleges do, college financial aid do, I think there might be lawsuits here. I think it's abusive. So you have people coming out with BA degrees, or in many cases, not even getting the degree because they don't finish, but they're now stuck with $60,000 to $100,000 of debt, which is in most bankruptcies undischargeable. And so they become kind of serfs. They're serfs of the Blue Academy, who are the very people telling them, sort of lecturing, this is what you must say, this is what you must do, this is, you're not a Hispanic, you're a Latinx, all of this kind of stuff. It's just infuriating, I think. And people and youth is naturally a little bit rebellious. and contrarian. So I think, and then, who ran the public schools that didn't give you a very good education? Why, gosh darn it, if it wasn't the teachers' unions, who, by the way, for particular people now who grew up during the pandemic, who like drew their full salaries and but didn't really do their jobs during the pandemic. The city where you walk into a CVS, a drugstore now, and like everything is locked up because your city doesn't, enforce shoplifting laws. I mean, the insanity of that. And then when you do, push the button and endlessly some clerk comes over and opens the locked case so that you can actually like buy, your hair conditioner. I mean, we're not talking about like diamond rings, right? Then the price is exorbitant, is really high. All right. And young people, all of this is just like this mess is thanks to these endlessly lecturing, holier than thou, more intelligent than thou, planners who seem to somehow be clustered with this democratic machine. So I'm actually not surprised that the establishment, the democratic establishment, isn't inspiring the loyalty that it hoped to among clients who, by and large, it's failing.
All right, that does it for the headlines this week. Let's have the big conversation. Walter, I know from some of our conversations, you have in your head a mix of historical knowledge that I think could shed some light for our listeners on the Trump phenomenon generally, and maybe also the future of the GOP that combines, political and social history of the American South with the tradition of Latin populists, and also what you might call Davy Crockett campaign techniques and rhetoric for a mass audience. You may end up writing about all this soon, but in the meantime, I think it's a unique perspective that our listeners probably haven't found elsewhere in the flood of Trump coverage. So give us a brief window into how you think about the evolving Trump phenomenon 8 years on.
Well, let me say first that if I do come up with something that's original to say about Donald Trump, I will really feel good about myself because if there's ever been, I mean, Donald Trump has unleashed more punditry than I think possibly than any human being in the history of the world. Certainly, no human being in world history has ever occupied as great a percentage of the total mind share of humanity for as long a period of time as Donald Trump has done. It's a phenomenon. Okay, so one thing, and this gets at some of the questions about how people from this hemisphere, migrants, have shifted, and their descendants have shifted toward Trump so much. If you know much about Latin American politics, figures like Donald Trump are not as uncommon south of the border as you might expect. I mean, the sort of populism in a society where a lot of people don't spend a lot of time reading books. Until recently, in Brazil, there were enough illiterate voters so that the parties, the stickers on the parties had animal stickers, to identify which party it was, so that non-literate people could make their political selection. And campaigns were heavily on TV and media driven, and it was a lot about the larger than life character. And sometimes people resorting to totally outrageous tactics. We've had that in this country. I think there was a governor of Texas, Jim Hogg, who named his daughter Ima Hogg. Poor Ima, in spite of this disability, I think went on to quite a career. Ultimately, is like a society figure, socialite in New York. And I take my hat off to Ms. Hogg. That was a really, she overcame a tough thing. But this sort of clownishness is one of the ways that a political figure, first engages the attention of voters. I think George Washington, supposedly, I read somewhere, spent most of his campaign budget on liquor for voters at his rallies, i.e., the voters wouldn't come to his rallies if there wasn't free liquor. Davy Crockett, in his memoir, I think, tells a story of when Davy Crockett actually served in Congress, which is one of my favorite political facts. And Davy Crockett was at the out at it was like a county fair or something, and he noticed that his opponent had like a huge crowd over at his end, and he had nobody. And then he figured out it's because his opponent, was buying drinks at the bar, and everybody was there wolfing this stuff down. Well, Davis said, "Well, I'm no idiot. I'll start doing that." And this was in a part of the West. This was at a time when there wasn't a lot of cash money in the West, and people used furs as money. So Davy had a bunch of beaver pelts or something, squirrel pelts. I don't know what kind of pelts they were. They were pelts, and he would slap one down on the bar, round of drinks for everybody, and a crowd comes and they're applauding his campaign. But he realizes after a while he's running out of pelts, and he slaps his last one down on the bar, and everybody drinks, but there's no more, and they start drifting away. He thinks, what am I going to do? What he did was he noticed that the bartender, rather incautiously, had put the pelts in a pile on the bar with the tails facing out. So he grabbed the lowest pelt by the tail, whipped it out of the pile, under the pile, slapped it back on top, and the liquor flowed and the crowd went on. All right. Okay. That is not a bad picture historically of the American political process. It is not a bunch of Platonic philosopher kings debating the issues. It's a very mass politics in our country is a very different thing from this sort of somewhat attenuated elite spectacle where everything has been driven by the proprieties and so on. Now, you could say that's some sort of an advance of the, over the old dirty mobs and riots and bought votes and outrageous courthouse thefts of votes, which, believe me, are some of the most common things in the history of the United States, common and widespread. North, south, east, west. And in some ways, yes. But you know what? Human nature has not changed that much since Davy Crockett was slapping pelts down on the bar in Tennessee. And so this sort of elite college boy spectacle, of bloodless debates and so on, occasionally interrupted by the dreadful Willie Horton ad or something that everyone goes, "Oh, tisk tisk." Okay, that is not our normal thing. So that in some ways, Trump's style of politics is reviving politics, mass politics, politics that are directed at emotions rather than reason, politics based in some ways on identity, what our Indian friends sometimes call vote banks of sort of large groups of people who all tend to vote in the same direction if you can stimulate their juices in the right way. It's more human. May not be better. That's a different question. But so I think Trump mainlined mass politics. And I think we shouldn't be surprised that a lot of people find that attractive. Now, what I think we will see very naturally is that other people are going to embrace it. After Andrew Jackson stunned the Whigs with his very populist style, they come out in, running against Martin Van Buren. It's Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And, they made up songs about Martin Van Buren let Van on his cushions of, drink wine and blah, 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 blah. Our guy is, drinks homebrew. And I think there was like 60 years when you couldn't even dream of becoming president of the United States unless you were born in a log cabin. So I am not surprised in a way that we're moving into that kind of politics. And Trump got there first, and he got a first mover advantage. So that's part of it. But there's also, in terms of the sort of substance of politics, and this is one I'm really puzzling over. So if I'm not yet coherent on the podcast. Maybe after I have time to think it through, I'll come up with an essay that says it more clearly. But the Republican Party today, to a very large degree, is the descendant of the old Democratic Party in the post-Civil War South. That is, almost all white Southerners belong to the Democratic Party from the 1870s, until maybe the 1960s and 70s. And the South was really, certainly when I was a kid, it was a one party, literally a one party state. And the real election every year was not the general election in the fall, it was the Democratic primary. And in the Democratic primary, you've not always, but very often, you had a contest between two kinds of candidates. One was what you might call a descendant of the old Whig Party. That is, they were pro-business. In a way, the South was the first successfully industrializing third world country. Because what they figured out after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, they realized we're poor now. We got nothing. The big advantage we have, thanks in part because these Yankees love tariffs so much, is that we can produce stuff in the South at lower wages. We can have lower regulations, be business friendly in every way you think. And so we can get that Yankee money to come down here and build up Southern industry. Oh, and by the way, we can use our politicians in Washington to make sure we're getting a lot of money for military bases. And you'll notice we have a lot of military bases in the South. Not an accident. This is a development strategy. And it worked. But you also had an opposition to that. You had people like Tom Watson, who was a famous Georgia populist, who were anti-corporate and saw, sort of the Southern oligarchy and the planters who were making money out of their association with the Northern bankers and railroads and all these people. That's the enemy. And we the people are fighting against capitalism. So is our goal as the South now to get back to where we ought to be by bonding with the capitalists and bringing in their money by giving them a better deal than they can get in the North? Or is it that we should form a common bond with Northerners who also don't like capitalism and fight for something different? And in general, too, that group tended to be more identitarian. Like, if somebody flew a Confederate flag outside their house, they were probably not somebody who was trying to attract a lot of Yankee capital to Atlanta. All right. It would probably be somebody who lived, was not as rich and was suspicious of all Yankee money, Yankee capital, everything else. And often the race question would be a turning point here, where people would, on both sides would try to turn racial politics into a flashpoint. Well, I hope people can hear some echoes of, say, the Trump and the J.D. Vance politics in this old populism, right? But what happened kind of historically was that with desegregation in the 50s and 60s, especially the Supreme Court decisions, and I'm old enough when I remember when it was the right that wanted to pack the court. I guess the right wouldn't mind packing the court again now if it could. And I do think, it'd be very funny if some Republican senators now jumped on and decided to co-sponsor the bill to increase the number of Supreme Court justices to 15. I think, Trump would like nothing more than to appoint 6 new justices to the Supreme Court. So bipartisanship, maybe get rid of the filibuster too. Anyway, desegregation really triggered a wave of the populist identity politics. Virginia actually closed its public schools rather than desegregate. And this idea of massive resistance, stand in the schoolhouse door. However, people noticed after a while, if you do like Birmingham and you have all of these crowds of vicious, angry people spitting at little girls who were trying to go to elementary school and bomb churches like in Montgomery, whatever. Amazingly, Yankees don't want to build factories in towns that do that. And executives of IBM don't want to come live in that kind of place. And so this choice became very stark. Do you cling to these cultural issues, which frankly at the time is racism, or do you overlook that in the interests of a development agenda? And after they tried the 50s and 60s resistance, by and large majority of the White South says, that is just not worth it. That is not, I don't even really, I'm not sure I believe all that old racial stuff anyway. And in any case, let's industrialize. Since World War II, things have been working a lot better for us. And so when the White South moves into the Republican Party, it is actually at a point where the populists are at their low ebb and the kind of, the capitalists, the Whigs, let's just say the old Whigs are at their highest. And that's a Newt Gingrich with his optimistic love of capitalism and his belief that free markets are really what we need. That is so contrary to the sort of historical social thinking of the majority of the White South. And I think but when this new American Republican Party, based on the White South plus allies elsewhere, comes in, it's in a form in which the New England Republicans didn't have such a problem. It was a gap the Bushes could bridge. Somebody like Reagan could be a uniting figure. But what has been happening, I think, is that up until the 90s, that it was working for the White South, that integrating with Northern capital was bringing all those factories were leaving the high wage North and coming to the low wage South. And then wages in the South were rising and people were, I'm not on the old cotton fields at home anymore. I'm working in an air conditioned factory for a really good wage. Yes, this is terrific. But then what happens when those factories start moving from the now moderate wage South to like the low wage Mexico, China, you name it. And so suddenly that old Southern development strategy is not working. And people are starting to feel the same kinds of stagnation of wages or worry about their jobs and security in the South that they'd been feeling in the Rust Belt. Well, that was not in the plan. And people started to go back to the old popular stuff. Meanwhile, the cultural divide is, the sort of the New England Yankeedom in its wisdom has decided that it's going to go woke. So now, okay, fine, you've accepted desegregation and your racial issues are now much more in the mainstream of America than being in some crazy zone that you had of segregation and God knows what. All right. Okay, we're going to move the goalposts here. Now, if you will not accept trans student, men playing women's sports or whatever, you're unacceptable, you're horrible, and so you have to move this way. So two things were happening. The culture wars were making it harder and harder, made the distance between kind of normal popular culture in a lot of the country and elite culture. It was getting much harder to bridge that gap. And the economic arguments for market capitalism and how it's going to make you really happy, we're also getting weaker. And Trump comes into this in the persona of one of the old Southern, Trump on racial issues and stuff, Trump is so far different from someone like Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who actually advocated lynching. We're talking about some, but you had a whole range of these Southern political demagogues doubling down on identity politics, preaching hatred of an elite that was seen as alien and hostile, and very much embracing a populist economic model rather than free market capitalism. It was this huge opportunity that I think a lot of folks, a lot of the modern Republicans had forgotten this history and had thought that what would happen in the 90s, that this, the 80s and 90s, Reagan Gingrich transformation of the Republican Party was somehow a law of nature. History had ended in the Republican Party as well as in the world at large, but it hadn't. And nobody else was competing effectively in that space. Trump saw it, moved in, and Trump's ability, Trump harmonizes beautifully with this old cultural and economic politics in the South. And I think at this point, for either Republicans or Democrats, the question is, not how do we return to the old unchanged status quo. And I don't think that's on the table. Now, the question is, how do we address how do we compete in this space, maybe with different programs, different ideas of how to achieve these goals? But, anybody who wants to have a serious political career in the United States outside of like a few House districts. I mean, Jeanette Rankin voted against both World War I and World War II in the House of Representatives. So you can have eccentric members of the House. But if you want a national political career, if you're not talking, if you aren't comfortable with the idea of America first, I'm not sure, what is he saying? America second? America third? What are you saying? If you're not comfortable with American identity in some way. And you could see the Democrats somewhat lamely trying to do this, waving the flag everywhere at the Republican at their convention, and all the sort of bunting and props. But people are too smart for that. They actually are smart about things. And when you pander ineffectively, you actually drive them farther away. So it's going to take a rethink. We're all going to have to, just dig a little deeper to try to connect with our inner American and figure out, what are the new debates? Trump right now has something close to a monopoly in this zone because there's nobody else with his skill, his vision, and his just sheer range of show business abilities, which are actually really important in politics in a time like ours, a media-driven mass politics age. So until there are people who can compete with Trump in these ways, I think Trump, has, he's been elected twice. You can convict him of felonies. You can call him an insurrectionist. You can have half a dozen court cases proceeding against him. You can make it impossible to say his name in polite society without spitting on the ground. And none of this makes the slightest bit of difference. And it won't until Trump's opponents learn to play on the same playing field that right now he dominates.
Fascinating. We'll have to leave it there for this week. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next time. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.